Welcome to the Avro Heritage Museum podcast. Our host today is Chris Plezak from the Talking Newspaper. He's joined by aviation expert Frank Plezak and Ian Peat, where we explore the significant milestones in the development of aircraft manufacturing, focusing on the establishment of the Avro Company and Woodford airfield. From the pioneering works of fluid dynamics at Manchester University to the rise of iconic aircraft like the Lancaster Bomber, this episode is packed with historical insights and fascinating anecdotes. Don't miss this enlightening exploration of aviation history.
Hello everyone, and a warm welcome from me, Chris Plezak, to this first feature-length episode of The Woodford Story, and we've called it Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines. Every story has a beginning and a context, so I went to the Woodford Avro Heritage Museum first to talk to Frank Plezak, blogger and aviation author, and I asked him to begin filling us in on some of the earliest developments of aviation in the Northwest as part of the background to the establishment of the Avro Company and the setting up of an airfield and an aircraft factory at Woodford.
Yeah, well, it predates Avro by quite some time, really. I suppose the first sort of steps into aviation was not really aviation, but it was in fluid dynamics. And that was done at Manchester University with a guy called Osborne Reynolds, who developed his fluid dynamics theories at Manchester University. And then I suppose it would be balloon flights in the late 1700s. There was lots of balloon flights around the Manchester areas. And then in the early 1900s, you'll be hearing about Avro, who started flying typically down south. But in the Manchester area, there was quite a few companies really that were involved in building rotary engines. Crossleys, the car manufacturer, started building them. And a company in Longsight called Empress Works, they started building them. And they actually started to build their own aeroplane. It wasn't particularly successful, but what it did give us was their engineer who started as an apprentice, a guy called John Alcock, who became famous, obviously much later, for being the first guy that flew across the Atlantic. So that was the first sort of steps into aviation. But then, you'll hear about this later, but Avro, who'd done much of his work down south, was moved back to Manchester by his brother, who wanted to keep an eye on him if he was sort of supporting him with his money. He started around Manchester, and then of course what we had was other aircraft manufacturers. We had during the First World War, we had an aircraft factory in Oldham that were building big bombers, and we also had what was known as the National Aircraft Factory Number 2 that was managed by the Crossley Car Company, and they built lots and lots of aeroplanes during the First World War and flew them from a field next to their site at Heaton Chapel in Stockport, and because there was quite a few manufacturers of aeroplanes in the area, none of which had their own airfields. They established what was called the Aircraft Acceptance Park at Alexandra Park near Didsbury, which we now know as Hough End Playing Fields, and that became Manchester's first airfield. And Avro used to test fly their aeroplanes from there eventually, as did the aeroplanes from Crossley's. I think they were taken there as well, and that lasted for quite some time. But then after that, there was lots and lots of other aviation-related sites. You'll hear about Metrovix. They made Avro products. They made Avro Manchesters, Lancasters and Lincolns. They also made their own jet engines and other aeroplanes. Ford, who'd been persuaded to build Merlin engines, and they built them to precision technology, and they built them with production line techniques introduced by Ford, and they became a really successful manufacturer of aeroplanes. There was other aeroplane manufacturers in Trafford Park as well. There was a company called Hills & Co. Some people know it as Hilsons. They made lots of aeroplanes for the Percival Aircraft Company, and they even modified their own aeroplanes to be biplanes, and even tested a Hurricane fighter plane with 2 wings, which was quite interesting. And then, of course, at Heaton Chapel, we had the National Aircraft Factory. That returned to be Crossley Cars, and Crossley eventually took a majority stakeholding in Avro, because Avro, after the First World War, diversified with a lack of aircraft orders to making things like cars. Crossley didn't like this, so So to remove that competition, they actually took a majority stake in Avro, and that lasted from 1920 to 1928 until Crossley was eventually they had problems and finally shut down, and their site was taken over by the Fairey Aviation Company at Heaton Chapel, and they made some of the most significant aeroplanes together with Avro that were built in the area. They built things like Fairey Barracudas, Fairey Fulmars, and later on they built things like Fairey Gannets, but a very, very significant aviation company in the area. And in North Manchester, we had in Bolton, we had de Havilland Propellers. They made most of the variable pitch propellers used on most of the aeroplanes in the Second World War, and they continued in production up until the 1960s. So very, very significant, as were some of the other locations we had. We've mentioned Alexandra Park Airfield. The first airfield in Manchester was actually at Trafford Park. It was, in those days, it was literally a park. It was a deer park, and they built a little airstrip there that was used, and it was the very first airfield that an aeroplane took off and flew away from Manchester. The first aeroplane to land at Manchester was the 1910 air race, of course, where there was two participants, Claude Graham White, the Englishman. Sadly, he didn't actually make it, and it was won by a guy called Louis Paulhan, and he landed in Burnage, to which there's a blue plaque there now to commemorating that event. So very, very significant in the area, yeah.
Is there a reason for that, do you think? It's just that we're a great region. Is it just because we're a big industrial area? Because it does seem an amazing amount of activity.
Well, there is all that, but I mean, during the early part of the 20th century, aviation was the big thing, and there was lots of people that were pushing aviation and demonstrating the capability and the abilities of aviation around. And Manchester, obviously, by that time had gone through the Industrial Revolution, and it transformed itself from being, a little city into the great city that it became and still is. So
I suppose there was money in it. That was the thing.
Money, yeah.
You always tend to think in these situations of big figures who were influential, and obviously Avro was one of them. Are there any other figures you think that, particularly once things have been established after these early days and we get towards, sort of run up to the Second World War and so on, are there any figures that come to mind?
Yeah, well, in Avro, as significant as he was, he employed two other very, very significant figures. The first was a guy called Roy Chadwick, who approached Roy for a job as an 18-year-old. He became his assistant and a draftsman. His name Roy Chadwick. And then a bit later on, a guy called Roy Dobson, a Yorkshireman, also entered the fray. And the two Roys, I think, are as significant in the name of Avro as Avro himself. Elliot actually left the company in 1928. After that, it was managed by the two Roys through to the sad death of Roy Chadwick in 1947.
Tell us a little bit about that. How did that happen?
They were actually test flying an Avro Tudor, which was a commercial airliner built after the war, a big four-engined propeller aeroplane. It was the Tudor, I think the Tudor Mark 7, and it had been in for a service, but one weekend they were doing a test flight on it, and unfortunately the ailerons had been rewired incorrectly, the opposite way in fact. So as the aeroplane took off and the pilot tried to correct the roll of the aeroplane, he just made it really worse. The aeroplane plummeted into the ground, or the wing hit the ground. The front of the aeroplane smashed off and careered across a farmyard, hit some trees by a pond. Pilots were actually flown out and actually drowned. They were believed to have survived the crash and drowned in the pond. But Roy Chadwick, who was stood between the pilots, unfortunately was killed when he was flown from the aeroplane. So very, very sad. So other names of the area are things like Joseph Whitworth, the engineering guy. He established massive engineering companies that were instrumental in building aeroplanes. He was born locally, as was John Sidley, who became part of the Hawker Sidley name. He gave his name to it. He, very, very significant in aviation, was also born locally within the Greater Manchester area. Yeah. Another name is Bernard Lovell, who worked at Manchester University on early radars and worked on what was known as the H2S radar that was used initially in Lancasters, and then it was developed further for use in the Vulcan. But he was, I suppose, most famous for his contribution to the Jodrell Bank radio telescope at Jodrell Bank. Yeah. Other names are Beatrice Schilling, perhaps not known by very many, but she was a student at Manchester University working on in the air engineering department when she heard of a problem with the Merlin engines that were used on the Hurricanes and Spitfire fighter planes. They had a problem where there were certain manoeuvres would cause a surge in fuel and the carburettor would stall and the engine would cut out. So not very good for those that were being used in combat. The pilots developed a technique for coping with it, but she looked at a solution to the problem and developed a little baffle that she inserted very, very cheaply and very simply into Spitfire and Hurricane engines to stop that, and it became known as Miss Schilling's orifice.
Frank Plezak there with that great piece of scene setting. So, who was Avro and what has been the history of Woodford? I spoke to Ian Peat, who's chair of the museum management group at the museum, to find out more.
His name is Elliot Verdenroe, but actually he was christened Edwin Elliot Verdenroe, but he always went by the name Elliot. He was born in 1877 in Patricroft, Eccles, and he was born into a large family, and he was a doctor's son. And the family had the idea that he would probably follow on from his father to be a doctor, but Elliot had other ideas, and he had quite a mechanical interest. So by the time he left school, he'd been involved with bicycles and how they worked, and he left school and he decided he wanted to go and make his fortune. So he set off to Canada, where he was performing a role as a surveyor. He then went working as an apprentice for the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Company. He showed his great interest in mechanical engineering at that point. Once he completed his apprenticeship, he went to London. He went on the merchant ships, and he was travelling between the UK and South Africa, and he very quickly recognised something amazing happening around him, which was he saw the giant albatross bird flying, and the albatross has a massive wingspan, and he was just amazed at how this bird could fly, and that really sparked his interest in aviation. And so coupled with that, the Wright brothers in 1903 had proven man can use powered flight, and seeing the albatross, he just thought, well, this is the world for me, and he got very much into aviation. He started developing his own model gliders, and in 1906 the Daily Mail ran a competition for people to make gliders and see how far they flew, and he won first prize of £75, which today isn't a lot of money really, but back then it was some serious money. So it helped him progress what he was trying to do. He got backing from his family to be able to help further, and he started to develop his own aeroplanes. He went down to London to do this, and he developed the Row 1 biplane, and unfortunately he got a little bit of a reputation as Row the Hopper, because the aeroplane just kind of hopped rather than flew. But by 1909 he developed the Row 1 triplane, and he became the first British person to fly an all British aeroplane with a flight of a couple of hundred yards. So he was the first. He came back up to Manchester, and with his Humphrey actually owned a company in Manchester making braces, and he had the basement of a mill in Manchester, and he allowed Elliot to build his aeroplanes in there, and actually they became the first incorporated aerospace company or aircraft company in the world in 1910.
When does Woodford itself come into the story?
The factory was in Anecdotes. They moved a few times actually as the business grew in size, to Clifton Street in Manchester, and then to Newton Heath. And it was really after the First World War that Avro needed a new airfield. Now the background to that was that they were using Alexandra Park, which is now Hough End Playing Fields in Manchester, as the airfield. build for flying aeroplanes. Normally, they'd either fly the aeroplane to a customer or they put it on a train, because the size of the aeroplanes back then, they weren't that big, but they put them on a train and deliver them to a customer by train. So if they were being flown, they go from Alexandra Park. But in 1918, Lord Egerton of Tatton, he'd said that 5 years after the finish of the war, then the airfield would have to be returned back to what it previously was. A decision had to be made of where AV Row were going to be flying the aeroplanes from. And they had a good look round, looking at various different places, but they centred on this place called Newhall Farm, which is Woodford. And we believe on the 17th of September 1924, they bought the farm in an auction. And the rest, as they say, is history.
And I would guess moving on into the 1930s, Second World War looming, what were the implications then for AV Row?
Okay, so in the 1920s, they were still developing aeroplanes, and aeroplanes were getting larger and larger, but AV Row had been taken over a number of times, and by 1934 they were now part of what is known as Hawker Siddeley, and the Hawker Siddeley organisation had got a fairly wide scope of aircraft under its banner, and one of them being the need to manufacture the Bristol Blenheim. Now, Bristol weren't a Hawker Siddeley organisation, but this particular aeroplane needed to be built for the UK government in large numbers. So Avro managed to pick up a subcontract building the Blenheim. Interestingly enough, the Blenheim was the first time that Avro came into involvement with an aeroplane with stressed skins, which was quite a change from the previous, where it was either fabric or wooden skins. So all of a sudden, Avro had got this ability to develop aircraft with stressed skins. And around about the same time, a new airplane was required, a strategic bomber by the government, and Avro came up with an airplane called the Avro Manchester, and that used the latest stressed skin knowledge. And this aeroplane was, I think, 200 aircraft were contracted for. Now, Avro had actually moved on from Newton Heath to a new factory at Chadderton, and at the time it was the largest aviation factory in the country. And the Avro Manchester was built at Newton Heath and at Chadderton. But like all predecessor aircraft, all the parts were actually shipped by road to Woodford, and Woodford was the assembly site. And once they assembled, they'd be tested and flown here and delivered to the customer. But what that meant with the Avro Manchester was they got a production line set up. But unfortunately, the Manchester, due to a number of reasons, but primarily the engine, had a Rolls-Royce Vulture engine on board, and the reliability of those engines wasn't so good. And the Ministry of Defence decided at one point, well, we're going to cancel the contract and get the Avro organisation to build something else. But Avro decided, and this is a chap called Roy Chadwick, who was a chief designer, he decided that no, the airframe of the Manchester is good. It's just we need to sort the engines out. And the engine he wanted was actually the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Merlin engines, they were in short supply because the Spitfires and the Hurricanes, they needed them for the various wartime efforts, including the Battle of Britain. The general manager of the site, Roy Dobson, had got good relationships with the Rolls-Royce company, and he spoke to the chairman, and he managed to talk him into providing 4 Merlin engines to Avros, and they were delivered to Ringway, where the Avro Manchester was being modified to take the additional engines. So it would have 2 engines on each wing rather than a single engine on each wing, which the Manchester aircraft was configured with. So January 1941, they rolled out the Avro Manchester Mark III from the sheds at Ringway, and the test pilot took the aircraft off, flew it around, landed it, came down the steps and said, we've got a winner here. And the decision was made there and then to call it a Lancaster.
And then Ford got involved, didn't they? They were brought into it in terms of making some of the engines.
Yes. So the real benefit of Ford being involved, that they brought mass production techniques to the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine program, which allowed the supply difficulties to be resolved. So they were able to produce many Merlin engines a lot quicker than had been previously the case.
Did they have far to bring them?
No, with Metrovix being in Trafford Park, it was a fairly short distance really to be able to bring those engines into Woodford.
And at the height of the war then, what was the machinery that was operating? So you've got Chatterton working, Ringway involved. Who was involved in rolling out those Lancasters, as quickly as possible, because it's a national emergency, wasn't it?
Well, yes, there were many thousands of people working across all of these sites. Ringway itself was more a development facility where Avros were further developing the Lancaster so it could take even greater bomb loads, and they were also working on other aircraft such as the Avro York, which was a passenger carrier which actually carried Winston Churchill many times around the world to visit lots of the people like Stalin and Roosevelt in developing the post-war world. But coming back to Chatterton was the major manufacturing site for the Lancaster. But because of the quantities required, they had set up lots of other sites as well. Eden in Leeds, which is now Leeds Airport, and at Chester, and at Metrovix in Manchester. So Woodford again became the predominant assembly site for the Lancaster. I think delivering over 4,000 Lancasters from Woodford out of a total of 7,500 Lancasters that were produced.
And how did they get these huge aircraft parts from Chatterton to here? I mean, that must have been a bit of a transport issue.
It was. They had low loaders that would carry them, but they would come through the streets of Manchester and through Stockport down the A6 all the way into Woodford. And I guess it must have been quite a sight to see them because the production rate for the aircraft was immense. On one particular day, they actually produced 12 Lancasters, which, if you think about that, that's 2 Lancasters an hour. Now, can you imagine the procession of Lancaster and parts coming down the roads of Manchester and Stockport? Unbelievable.
And was the Woodford site ever bombed? Because presumably it would have been a prime target, wouldn't it?
We think the enemy tried to find it, but the actual buildings were never actually bombed. Wasn't true of Chatterton, though. Chatterton was actually hit. Fortunately, it turned out to be Easter Monday, 1942, I think it was. And management had actually allowed, the first time for a long time, the workers to actually have a day off. So that particular day, when the bomb hit, nobody was killed or injured. What it did do, it damaged the supply area of rivets. So the rivet store, and rivets are very, very important in manufacturing aeroplanes, and the rivets were scattered all over the place. So the problem was, how do you actually identify rivets and put them all back in the right boxes so that when they go out onto the shop floor for production, that the workers have got the right size rivets? Somebody came up with a bright idea, and that was to contact the Henshaw School for the Blind, and they came along, and because of their touch and feel and dexterity, they could actually size rivets far easier than a sighted person. So they fairly quickly put all the rivets back in the right boxes, and production was hardly impacted.
And what are the highlights post-war then for Avro and for Woodford?
Well, for Avro, the aeroplanes that were built after the Second World War, from a propeller point of view, the major one was the Shackleton, which was a maritime reconnaissance aeroplane, which was built on the basis of the Avro Lincoln, which predecessor was the Avro Lancaster. So there's a linkage all the way back through. But the major project after the war really was the Avro Vulcan. So the Vulcan came about with the need for to have a nuclear deterrent. So the government, we'd now entered the nuclear age, and the government had a requirement for an aeroplane to drop a nuclear weapon if needed. So they put a requirement out, and a number of companies responded to the requirement, and Avro were one of those companies. And they decided that they wanted an aeroplane. Well, the government decided that they wanted an aeroplane that could fly at least 50,000 feet, which is like twice as high as the Lancaster would have been flying, to fly at 500 knots, again twice as fast as the Lancaster would have been flying, and to carry a bomb load very similar to what the Lancaster could carry, which was 10 to 14,000 pounds. But the government could not actually define what that bomb load would be because it was all secret. So Avro looked at this requirement and decided, well, the air is thin very high up, so we need a really big wing. So they decided to go for a delta-winged aeroplane. Now, nobody knew much about delta-wing aeroplanes.
This is like Concorde, isn't it, basically?
Like Concorde, yeah, a big delta. So the first thing they decided to build a number of smaller scale aeroplanes called the Avro 707s, and those 707s were used to test and understand the operation of an aeroplane with a delta wing at high speed, at low speed, and the system integration of all the various different systems that would be required. And out of that became the Avro Vulcan. First flight of the Vulcan was 1952, and first delivery to the RAF was 1956. These are the Vulcan B Mark 1s, and they provided, along with the Vickers Valiant and the Handley Page Victor, the nuclear deterrent. The Vulcan was modified further, and in 1961, I think, the Vulcan B Mark II came out, which had better engines, better defensive aid systems on board, just in case somebody tried to attack it. And it would also carry a nuclear weapon called the Blue Steel. And the Blue Steel was actually manufactured here at Woodford in the Weapons Research Division. And that would be an early, what they call nowadays, a standoff bomb, where you would go to the near the target and then allow the weapon itself to then fire and engage and fly to the target from a distance away, giving the crews at least a chance of getting away. Where they would have gone to after a nuclear explosion, I have no idea, but fortunately that never happened.
So another absolutely key aircraft in the defence of this country, isn't it? And am I right, the Vulcans were about to be retired around the Falklands War, but then something happened that meant more work had to be done.
Yes, indeed. So the RAF provided 5 Vulcans that were going to be retired to Woodford, and in the space of 3 to 4 weeks, those aircraft were modified to become air-to-air refuelling tankers, and then were delivered back to the RAF. I think in all there were 6 Vulcan flights to the Falklands, engaging the enemy, and on each of those flights, it was something like 16 Victors were used to be able to give them enough fuel to get there and back.
And to round off, Ian, what were the closing chapters then of the Woodford story?
So in the 1980s, a decision was made where Woodford would heavily focus on the civilian market. And previously we had an aeroplane called the 748, Hawke Siddeley 748, and that sold to many operators around the world. That was a 40 to 50 seat civilian aircraft. In the 1980s, this was superseded by an aeroplane called the Advanced Turboprop, the British Aerospace ATP, and that would be 60 to 70 seater. Sales of that went okay for a while, but started to tail off. And at the same time, while they're focusing on the civil side, the British Aerospace 146, which was built at Hatfield, they were selling really well. And the company decided to set up a second production line here at Woodford. So we had 2 production lines at Woodford for the ATP and the 146. As the ATP sales started to tail off, it was decided to really focus on the 146. And around about the same time, the company, British Aerospace, decided to close the Hatfield site and centre all of the 146 production up at Woodford. In early 1990s, the 146 got an upgrade, and it became the regional jet. And at the same time, the company tried to do a joint venture with Taiwan, and that fell through. But out of it, they reused the famous old name Avro. So the company were now selling, once again, Avro aircraft called the Avro Regional Jet. So the Avro RJ70, RJ85 and RJ100. And those sold really well. Lots of blue chip airlines bought them, the likes of British Airways, Sabina, Crossair, and Lufthansa, all operators. And then in early 2000s, obviously we had the World Trade Center disaster, and people stopped flying for a while, which meant that people selling aeroplanes didn't sell as many aeroplanes. Woodford became the final assembly site, the MRA4. That project started to hit a number of issues which delayed the entry into service, which should have been 2003, but the workforce carried on quite diligently and was sorting out the problems. But unfortunately in 2010 the government government decided in the Strategic Defence and Security Review to cancel the project. And with that, Woodford ceased to be a manufacturing site of aircraft. And 2011, the airfield was closed as an active runway. And from then, it was sold for housing.
Yeah, and from then into the Air Heritage Museum, but that's for a later programme. But thank you ever so much for that amazing resume. Thanks again to Frank and to Ian for sharing their encyclopedic knowledge with us. It was fascinating to talk to them. Next time, we learn more about the first of Avro's and Woodford's emblematic aircraft, the Lancaster Bomber, through the story of radio operator and gunner Sergeant John Monaghan, told in his own words. It's a great listen, so please try and join us.
Make sure you follow us in your podcast app to ensure that you don't miss out on future episodes.